The question of the hour, is a constitutional crisis now officially upon us? From the invocation of an 18th century law that was the basis for some of the darkest chapters in America's history, things like the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, now being used to deport hundreds of people, to the sudden removal of an immigrant doctor here legally, both moves seemingly from what we know at this hour, at the time in open defiance of court orders. A series of developments over the last 48 hours point to a Trump administration acting as though it is now unencumbered by the law and things like court rulings. In just an hour from right now, federal judge James Boasberg will hold a hearing on whether the Trump administration violated his ruling when it deported hundreds of Venezuelan migrants to a prison camp in El Salvador. They were deported after Donald Trump invoked the 1798 Alien Enemies Act on Saturday afternoon. Of that, NPR reports this, quote, the Alien Enemies Act allows an expedited removal process, which means those subject to the president's declaration would not go through the normal immigration proceedings in court or be able to claim asylum. The proclamation also leaves no time to contest the government's claims that people are members of a criminal gang. The executive order invoking the law was challenged in court immediately, and the judge was crystal clear in his order putting a stop to the deportations under the Alien Enemies Act. Again, from the judge, Judge Boasberg said this, quote, you shall inform your clients of this immediately, and that any plane containing these folks that is going to take off or is in the air needs to be returned to the U.S. But those people need to be returned to the United States. However that's accomplished, whether turning around a plane or not embarking anyone on the plane or those people covered by this on the plane, I leave to you. But this is something that you need to make sure is complied with immediately, end quote. Could not be clearer. Turn the planes around. The people do not get off the planes. And yet, again, from everything we know at this hour, those migrants deported under that law appear to have been deported anyway. According to flight records reviewed by the Washington Post, quote, 2 flights left Harlingen, Texas for El Salvador as the federal judge was reviewing the case. And a 3rd flight left shortly after a written order was issued. The president of El Salvador, a staunch ally of Donald Trump's, seemed to mock the judge's order in a tweet on Sunday, quote, oopsie, ... too late. End quote. America's Secretary of State, one-time Senator Marco Rubio, shared that post. The White House, which alleges that the migrants deported were gang members, denies defying any judge, but they also claim that no judge has a right to order a stop to the deportation of hundreds of Venezuelan immigrants to a prison camp in El Salvador. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said in a statement, quote, a single judge in a single city cannot direct the movements of an aircraft carrying foreign alien terrorists who were physically expelled from the U.S. soil, end quote. And there is more defiance of the courts to tell you about. It's the second such incident in as many days of the Trump administration appearing again, based on everything we know, to ignore explicit court rulings on immigration. The Trump administration this weekend also deported a doctor, Dr. Rasha Alawi. She is a kidney transplant specialist and a Brown University professor. She was here in the U.S. on a visa, a legal visa. That's despite a judge's order demanding 48 hours notice before moving her, with an explanation as to why she was being moved. On this, the New York Times reports, quote, there is a shortage of American doctors working in Dr. Alawi's area of specialty, transplant nephrology. Foreign-born physicians play an important role in the field, according to experts. Fear over immigration status could, quote, harm the pipeline even more, end quote. That's according to Dr. George Bayless, who works in the Brown Medicine kidney transplant program with Dr. Alawi. Her patients included individuals awaiting transplants and those dealing with the complex conditions that can occur after a transplant. He called Dr. Alawi, quote, a very talented, very thoughtful physician. We are all outraged, he added, and none of us know why this happened. So as to why it happened, according to documents filed in court, officials with Customs and Border Protection say that Dr. Alawi had photos and videos of Hezbollah on her phone. that she attended the funeral of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and admitted to following his teachings, quote, from a religious perspective, end quote. As to why she was deported despite a court order, Politico reports this, quote, in a sworn declaration filed with the court that CBP officials at Boston's Logan Airport hadn't received formal notification of the court order through official channels before Alawi was put on an Air France flight bound for Paris Friday night. This is where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. New York Times legal correspondent Matthias Schwartz joins us. Also here, immigration policy expert Andrea Flores, Vice President for Immigration Policy and Campaigns at Forward U.S. And with me at the table, former top official at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman's here. Andrew, let me actually ask you to take on the question that we started with. Is a constitutional crisis upon us?
The answer is yes, although the one thing I will say is that in the court filings, let's leave aside what we're hearing from the White House and people who are sort of cutouts of the White House, because that's where there definitely is a constitutional crisis. In the court filings, the Department of Justice is trying to, although it's as tenuous and as, I think, implausible as possible, to say why they didn't violate the court's order. And they have a number of reasons, and they're actually trying to avoid ever going back to Judge Boasberg, who, by the way, is the chief judge in D.C. I mean, he is the head lawyer for that court overseeing this. And he has a hearing at 5 o'clock, presumably, to decide this issue of contempt. So I would say the Department of Justice is trying to thread a very, very, very small needle. I'm more concerned by the statements coming from that you did the clip of the press secretary saying no judge can do this. I'm sorry, who on God's green earth is she to say that? That's what the courts are for. Pam Bondi said that she's free to criticize the judge in terms of she thinks he's wrong. She is saying that we're appealing it. All of that is fair game.
Right.
But she went further, and she said that he is, by his ruling, supporting terrorists. That is the first line of her statement. That is from the Attorney General of the United States. And so, to me, it's those comments that are leading to that constitutional crisis. That is just not how you speak, whether you're the head law enforcement officer or anyone else in the government. Fair game is to criticize the judge, and appeal. And they have appealed, and that's their right. And they may win and they may lose. That's sort of separate. That's a separate issue. Just to be clear on the merits of this, Judge Boasberg on the Alien Enemies Act has substantial grounds to support what he did. That's very much going to get into the weeds. But let's just say, even if you thought reasonable minds could differ, who says because you've said the government doesn't have a statutory basis to do something and you say you can't do it, that means that you are siding with terrorists? And by the way, they have not been determined to be terrorists. As you noted at the outset, there's been no hearing on that. And of all people to be understanding of defendants' rights and the right to a hearing, and that you shouldn't take executive action as being the end-all and be-all, it should be defendant Donald Trump. He was a defendant in 4 criminal cases. If there's anybody who should know and understand and respect due process of law, it should be him, because he was himself protected by it.
Let me just clarify a legal question. I feel like what you're sort of saying without saying is that there was a lawful way, most likely, to deport these individuals. That what he's done by doing it in defiance of a court order is almost mixed 2 principles here. One is his absolute authority on deportations, but the second is both the defiance of a court order and the incredible smear against the judge that called for them to stop.
I guess I'm saying a little less than that. I actually am not going as far to say that there was a lawful way to do this. Judge Boasberg said under the statute doesn't apply, and so that will get litigated. The backup argument that the government's now making and is trying to say why they were not in defiance is they said, OK, I understand that you said we couldn't do this under the statute, but we actually could do it under the president's inherent Article 2 power. That's an argument. We don't know what the Supreme Court will do with it. I think it's a tough argument, but at least it's a way of trying to go through this little needle of saying we didn't actually violate your order, Judge, because we were acting under the Constitution, not under the statute, which was all that was challenged.
This story on the Trump administration newly testing the power of the courts, sometimes appearing to openly defy them, facing legal, nonpartisan, and liberal criticism because of the move here over the weekend to go forward with deportations despite what appeared to be clear orders from a federal judge. This clash right now, and I'm going to walk you through it, it does raise the prospect of the Trump administration deliberately defying court orders. Now, that claim itself is part of the dispute. We are going to go through this with the available facts, and as always, reporting everything we know from all sides so you can make up your own mind. But there are valid questions here about whether this is now, and I'm going to say it plainly, an intentional autocratic effort by the Trump administration to break the law and then violate judicial orders that enforce the law they are accused of, and in some cases, according to judicial findings, having been found to have broken. Now, that prospect goes farther than most presidencies in the modern era. You could go back to Nixon for very negative examples where we had a similar pattern. In fact, it goes farther than Donald Trump's first term, which, whatever you think of the politics or the ethics or the rhetoric or the leadership of that first term, we did not see in the main, on a regular basis, what we're seeing here in this new clash from President Trump, 45th President of the United States, first term. So I can measurably show you with evidence why this is concerning, extreme, radical, and potentially lawless. But what we're going to do right now with our report is just go through first the facts we have on this very big controversy. It began with the weekend clash over immigration powers, the administration deporting hundreds of migrants on an emergency basis without any apparent due process. That's based on what we know that came out of a very rushed, controversial process. And again, if we learn more about possible improvements or enhancements to that, we'll tell you. But right now, that's what we know. The administration basically alleged or said these individuals were gang members and then invoked a wartime law, the Alien Enemies Act, and then a judge halted those planned deportations, I should say, under that plan. Now, let me be very clear with you. That kind of judicial order is the final word until and unless a higher court intervenes. That's the end of it. And as I said, in the first term of the Trump administration, that's how these things went. You might remember the travel ban was halted, and then it was narrowed, and then parts of it went forward. All of that went through the process that I'm reporting for you, where courts rule and the administration and all of the many officials and agents involved in these type of things follow the law. And the law is what the last word came out of the courts. But now this administration, which has previously followed court orders and did so across the first term, has taken a very different tack, and we have evidence to believe it is not incompetence or a mistake, which, while a big deal, would play out differently, but that it's intentional. This time, despite the order, those planned deportations that had supposed to have been halted went forward, and that plane took off.
President Trump has invoked a wartime law known as the Alien Enemies Act
to deport suspected members of a Venezuelan gang.
A federal judge immediately blocked the president's proclamation.
He ordered the planes deporting Venezuelans to immediately return to America.
The White House is disregarding a judge's ruling on deportations, claiming in this case the court has no authority in the matter,
setting up a potential constitutional challenge.
The migrants flown from Texas to El Salvador. You can see them getting off the plane where they were taken into custody. This video was shared by an administration that is seen as allied with the Trump administration, the leaders of El Salvador. The judge had ruled to stop what you see happen there. And as for the claim by Trump's lawyers that he had war powers that could supersede the normal way these things work, that was invalid because the U.S. was not at war, the judge noted. So the move violates the plain text of the Alien Enemies Act. It also exceeds the limited authority granted to, in this case, Trump's executive branch, by Congress under law, the judge ordering that the migrants be returned to the U.S. unless the plane had landed and they had already disembarked in a foreign country. So that's clear. And beyond the written order, the judge stated any plane containing these folks that is going to take off or is in the air needs to be returned to the United States. So what you see there is a series of acts and events. And remember, for everything that comes down from the president through border officials, through political appointees, there is then the rest of the people inside the government who are U.S. officials who are supposed to follow the rule of law. They all know and have been through this drill before that the rule of law in the United States does not start and end with politicians, heaven forbid, as many people might say. It is ultimately overseen through judges that enforce constitutional limitations. So anyone, any U.S. official aware of those limitations as ruled on by a judge knows the last word is the judge, and you shouldn't be following unlawful orders. Indeed, you took an oath to the Constitution, not to any random president. But maybe we are in a moment where those things are changing. Maybe people are more worried about being ousted and fired legally or semi-legally by Donald Trump and Elon Musk than they are worried about a legal process. Maybe Donald Trump's wanton use of the pardon power, including for people who violently attacked police and others, makes those folks far less worried about any potential federal charge that might come later down the road if it's not going to come out of Trump's DOJ, since he issued the order. And even if it did come out of some other independent process, if he's president, he's certainly willing to hand out pardons for anyone politically loyal to him, even when it means violence against police and others. So that's the context. Now I want to show more reporting on this. Veteran reporter Mark Caputo with Axios filed this exclusive on how the Trump White House deliberately ignored this judge's order, that a judge found Trump basically broke the law, and Trump defied the order on that. Axios' headline you see there is clear. And they, with Caputo's reporting, have this key detail, which would suggest the White House knowingly ignored or violated the order because they had an aggressive legal theory that the flights were at that point over international waters, and therefore they say the ruling didn't apply, citing two senior officials. Well, that's huge because, of course, the U.S. Constitution and U.S. law applies to what the president and U.S. officials do. And just because you run away from the order after, as I said, it was issued and then get to international waters does not mean the place you came from and the color of law and the government you're acting under become irrelevant and melt away. And if you're listening to all this, watching on the news, watching it later on YouTube, listening to me on one of those serious audio reports, I promise you from the sound of my voice that if you're thinking, well, I don't know how much I care about these people who are called gang members, we're all going to care a hell of a lot if the United States government under Donald Trump could ever apply a legal theory like this, because its logical conclusion means if they take you off site somewhere else and can do whatever they want, well, then it's open season on just about anyone, because it's not that hard to throw someone on a plane violating a court order and getting them out to international waters. Well, there was also a third plane that took off later, and then a White House official, disarmed from all those other explanations I just referenced, simply and brazenly claimed it doesn't matter when the flights took off because this was a baseless legal ruling. So this is pretty serious. It's obviously serious for the Constitution, and if the administration is defying that, it's serious for anybody impacted right now, which includes obviously the people deported. Without due process, though, the nation won't really know if they are who the government says they are. And just to go back to the basics, that's why the United States has a constitution that supersedes any single politician, why our founders established those rights and rule of law to begin with. And they warned against exactly the potential abuse of these kind of moves, and how if you start denying rights to some, even if some of them might be guilty or might through a more slowed down process still be found eligible for deportation, right, if you have evidence on them about their legal status or criminal activity, etc. But how those moves can then be used against anyone if there's no check on tyrannical governments. That's the whole point of the Bill of Rights. So it's serious. And yet, we do live in strange political times. And we know that cynical bids to grind people down, to exhaust everyone, and normalize almost anything are part of this right-wing process and playbook. Even a violent insurrection can be normalized. It might not even be a conscious strategy at this point. It's a kind of cynical political instinct where anything can be defended and then normalized and even eventually online trolled, as the term goes, which is the lens I invite you to consider for this post here, retweeted by Marco Rubio. What you're looking at is a very cynical post from a Trump ally there about what happened, with oopsie written there. So America's top diplomat, Marco Rubio, is reposting this. So he's basically sharing this to everyone. Oopsie, too late. A kind of dunking on the judge to normalize this type of legal defiance. The post is from the Trump ally who runs El Salvador, and you can see, too late, the laughing emoji. LOL. How funny. How unserious. And I mentioned trolling because that's the political term of art of trying to get people to be so upset over this that they miss that, yada, yada, yada. But I want us to understand what it means when this is happening from the top diplomat in the United States, a very powerful position, Secretary of State, which Marco Rubio got because he was willing to publicly disavow everything he's ever said about Donald Trump and foreign policy, to eat his own words, because he warned about exactly the thing that he is now doing. He warned about the con, about taking advantage of people, about just using a showmanship and as Rubio put it, a con man's pack of lies to betray what America is and should be. So LOL, Marco Rubio, let's remember what you used to warn us about.
What we are dealing with here, my friends, is a con artist.
He's taking advantage of Americans who are hurting.
If he builds the wall the way he built Trump Towers, he'll be using illegal immigrant labor to do it.
And all this economic news, as new NBC News polling shows, Americans are not happy with President Trump's handling of the economy so far. 44% approve, while 54% disapprove. And the numbers are even worse on handling of inflation and cost of living specifically. Look at that, 42% approve and 55% disapprove. Joining us now, former Democratic Senator from Alabama, Doug Jones, and former Republican Congressman from Pennsylvania, Charlie Dent. Congressman Dent, Trump has never fared this poorly on the economy in a national NBC News poll. In fact, he's never been underwater. Of course, he's slammed polls before. He likes them when they're good. If polling reaches a critical mass, do you see him changing course at all, especially when this is supposed to be his issue?
Well, the polling numbers are certainly not very good for President Trump, specifically on the economy, for the reasons you just stated. First, we should note, too, that his numbers among independents are particularly bad. The country is hopelessly divided on a partisan basis. So a lot of Republicans, the base of the party, still supports Donald Trump. The Democrats, of course, very much oppose him. But it's these independent numbers that are really terrible for Donald Trump. And I do think he's going to need to change course. I'm not convinced that he will, because he absolutely believes these tariffs are going to somehow help grow the economy and lower prices, which really flies in the face of all the economic arguments we hear from people who understand these issues. So I think right now he's in some trouble. He needs to course correct.
Yeah, one other note that I had highlighted on my sheet, 54% of Americans say that the country's headed in the wrong direction right now. Senator Trump won the election largely because Americans weren't happy with the state of the economy under the Biden administration. Trump is now at his weakest on what has been one of his strongest issues. Right. How do Democrats pounce? Can they?
I think they absolutely can, but I don't think they can pounce by just simply pointing to the price of eggs today, because there's a lot of things that are going on. I think what the Democrats need to constantly do over and over is not necessarily talk about just now, but talk about all these other things that are giving Democrats and giving people in America a lot of concern. All the cuts to the jobs, all the chaos, the Ukraine situation, the Gaza situation, all of this, the entire CR None of this is affecting household prices. None of this. Nothing he is doing that is getting all in the news. The retribution, the firing of all of the folks that were part of investigations into him. That's not doing anything to help household income. It's not doing anything to help inflation. So I think that the Democrats need to every day, every time there is an issue that does not deal with what I now am saying, all politics is personal, they need to remind the American people about that and continue to do that over and over.
You touched on the thousands of federal workers being fired or feeling in limbo. Well, this new polling also shows Americans actually aren't against the concept of DOGE. 33%, in fact, said it should continue as much more needs to be done. 28% said it is needed, but it should slow down to assess the impact. Yet we do know Americans don't love Elon Musk. 51% had a negative view of him, while Americans are largely supportive of federal workers. So, Congressman Dent, kind of a mixed bag there. Is there long-term danger for Republicans in this White House if they continue on the current path?
Of course. Look, if you ask a polling question, do you think that the government should become more efficient and we could engage in a strategic reduction in force? Overwhelmingly, Americans are going to say, yes, do it. I certainly support that. The problem for the Trump administration is that Elon Musk has been talking about chainsaws and wood chippers and has been carrying out this DOGE mission very inhumanely and cruelly. And I think a lot of Americans are appalled by that, and particularly as they see indiscriminate firings of people at the National Nuclear Security Administration or at the national parks, the guy who controls the keys to the bathrooms. I mean, there are all sorts of things where they're firing people and having to recall them. So they don't like the way this is done. So I think this is a real vulnerability for Republicans. And remember, too, most federal workers do not live in the D.C. area. They're scattered around the country. And so this is going to be a real problem for him. Musk is a liability given his high unfavorabilities at this point.
Senator, I want to pivot because I have to ask you about this social media post this morning. The president claiming President Biden's preemptive pardons of January 6th committee members and others are invalid because they were signed with an auto pen. He says they are hereby declared void, vacant, and of no further force or effect. Senator, you're a former federal prosecutor and constitutional lawyer. You know a thing or two about the law. Can he do this? Is auto pen an issue?
No, hell no. I mean, that is as absurd as a president of the United States trying to hawk cars on the lawn of the White House. This has gotten to almost be a comedy routine sometimes between chainsaws and Teslas on the White House, and now something like this. It's just absolutely ridiculous. Everyone knows that any pardon like that would go through. It's not a problem. You know, this is just one sideshow after another. And Anna, I want to go back real quick, though, and I know we don't have time, but as Charlie was saying, when people start connecting the dots between these cuts in the federal civil service and the things that affect them, for instance, we had a lot of lives saved this past weekend with those bad storms, thanks to NOAA and the National Weather Service. A lot of those people are going to be cut. FEMA's going to be cut. That's going to help, rebuild some of this. Those are the things that I think people are going to be really connecting those dots and are going to be very concerned about going forward.
Former Senator Doug Jones, former Congressman Charlie Dent, thank you both for the conversation. I appreciate you.
Okay, I was out last week. I stored up a lot of thoughts about all sorts of things. I did watch the whole government funding debacle from afar. It feels to me like it's about time for a really honest conversation about Democratic leadership in Washington right now and what the heck is going on there. So we're definitely going to have that conversation tonight. I have my own thoughts I'm going to share with you, too. There are also some good things happening out there, no doubt. I mean, we're going to talk about those, too. Democrats like Tim Walz held town hall meetings in red districts over the weekend. That's great. Senator Ruben Gallego held a town hall in Phoenix, Arizona today. He's going to join me later tonight to talk about how that went. We're also going to talk about the hearing tonight over deportations that just wrapped up. Ryan Riley was in the courtroom. He's hustling over here to the studio, and he's going to tell us about everything that happened in that room and what the judge had to say. But I wanted to start tonight with what I kind of think is one of the unifying principles of this administration. And that is basically their myopic view on owning the libs, as they call it. They love to own the libs. To the extent that they have one goal, owning the libs seems to be that goal. And by that, they mean doing anything they can to offend, humiliate, or destroy things that anyone left of Sean Hannity may possibly care about. I mean, Donald Trump visited the Kennedy Center for a board meeting today after seizing control of it and making himself the new chair. What a good use of time for a president. The Kennedy Center now, I think all of you probably know what it is, but it's been an arts institution here in Washington, D.C. for over 50 years. Lots of people perform there, all sorts. They're not political. But to Trump, it was too woke and needed to be straightened out. So yes, to own the libs, Trump is basically destroying the Kennedy Center. People are refusing to perform there anymore. And he basically said so himself today.
We'll make it great again, but it is so much like what I'm witnessing in other places. We have open borders. We have men playing in women's sports. It's all the same thing. It's all the same mentality and thinking.
I mean, it's all the same mentality and thinking. The Kennedy Center, the culture wars, actual policy of any sort, it's all the same thinking to Trump. And it's exactly the same thinking when it comes to the way he and Elon Musk are gutting the federal government. I mean, take NOAA, which is the agency responsible for things like forecasting our weather and tracking climate trends and responding to extreme weather events. Most people accurately see it as an apolitical tool for knowing what the weather is going to be outside, which, hey, we all rely on. A place where a bunch of science nerds prepare for natural disasters. That's what happens in that building. But Project 2025 labeled it as, quote, one of the main drivers of the climate change alarm industry. Think about how absurd that statement is. This is an agency made up of scientists who are literally measuring and predicting weather patterns, some of which are caused by, yes, the climate crisis, and they're destroying that agency. That's the goal. That's front and center for the Trump team. That's what they're trying to do. Now, over the past few weeks, the Trump administration has slashed hundreds of NOAA staff, including people responsible for producing critical weather forecasts and maintaining radar systems, and they're not done. The agency is tasked with cutting an additional 1,000 jobs, which means 10% of its workforce. See, to Donald Trump and his buddy Elon Musk, NOAA is just another woke agency that stirs up climate hysteria. And so it's one of the agencies that has found itself in their crosshairs. But here's the thing. When devastating tornadoes swept across the country this week, it actually wasn't coastal Democrats in their path at all. It was states like Mississippi and Arkansas and Alabama and Missouri, states that would definitely not self-identify as woke in any way, and states that would definitely benefit from a fully operational and fully staffed and fully funded NOAA. What about FEMA, which provides essential tools for cleaning up and rebuilding after devastating storms, like the ones we also saw last week and this week? Trump and Elon Musk claim the agency is a political tool wielded by Democrats during disasters. I don't even know what they mean by that exactly. So guess what they've done? They've cut jobs there too. And Trump has even mused about shutting it down altogether. That's how they're owning the libs, I guess, right? I mean, that's their approach. But guess which states get the most recovery funding from FEMA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development? Well, states like Louisiana and Florida and Texas, not exactly target Democratic states, those ones typically. Notice the theme here? See, the things they've already done and things they're planning to do actually hurt red states more than blue states. They're trying to own the libs, but they're actually hurting Trump voters. The people they are hurting the most are in the very states that voted to put Trump in the White House. And we're seeing this everywhere, all the time. It's happening every day. They're hurting red states by working to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, even though 80% of the investments are in Republican districts. They'll continue to hurt people who voted for them if they go after Social Security, which 1 in 5 Americans across every single state rely on. And they'll hurt lots of proud MAGA members if they go after Medicaid. In one Appalachian county in Kentucky, almost 90% of the residents in Harlan County, that's what I'm talking about, voted for Trump, and almost half of them received Medicaid. One woman relying on a Medicaid-funded treatment program for addiction told the Washington Post, if it were to go away today, I would be homeless tomorrow. I would lose everything, all my counseling, all my treatment. If Trump takes the things that they're saying, it's going to be devastation for Eastern Kentucky for sure. And you don't have to just to take her word, or my word for that matter, for it. Here's Steve Bannon.
A lot of MAGAs on Medicaid. I'm telling you, if you don't think so, You are dead wrong. Medicaid's going to be a complicated one. Just can't take a Medex to it, although I would love to.
I mean, the music in the background there is really quite something. But the point is, that guy is not exactly known for his empathy. He's not really a super empathetic guy. But he understands the political reality of Medicaid and other issues, too. Trump is also hurting red states with his beloved tariffs. He loves those tariffs. According to New York Times analysis, nearly 8 million Americans work in industries targeted by tariffs, and the majority are Trump voters. The jobs that could be hit by retaliation are especially concentrated in pockets of the upper Midwest, South and Southeast, including many rural parts of the county that are responsible for producing agricultural goods. And again, don't take my word for it or their word for it. Here's Mike Pence.
The truth is, when it comes to tariffs, the importer here in the United States pays the tariff. The foreign country doesn't pay the tariff. More often than not, passes along the increased costs on that product to the consumer. Too often I hear the administration talking about broad-based unilateral tariffs that I think will ultimately work against American jobs, American families, and American business.
There you heard it from noted liberal crusader, as he's well known, Mike Pence. See, what's becoming increasingly clear is that in this broad effort to own the libs, Donald Trump is actually owning his own voters. And you wonder why Republicans don't want to hold town meetings out there.